And welcome to the respiratory system. This will be in two parts. So there'll be part A, this PowerPoint, and then part B, but they'll be separate lectures. So away we go. So with the respiratory system, I think about the respiratory system is very much like an upside down tree where you have a trunk and then your major limbs, and then you branch until you get to the microscopic alveolar sacs, which would be equivalent to the leaves. So you have the respiratory tends to be about gas exchange because you're breathing in oxygen, you're exhaling carbon dioxide, and those respiratory gases are what we are moving. We're moving it through the conducting zones. We're moving it through a series of tubes. And these tubes are pretty thick. They are composed of epithelial cells and then a big smooth muscle layer that's nice and round so that you can either constrict the bronchi or you can dilate the bronchi. And these conducting zones will eventually lead you to the microscopic alveolar sacs where you can exchange respiratory gases. Prior to that, you can move the gases, you can move the air, but you don't actually do the exchange until you get to the alveolar sac. So the respiratory is where you exchange, right, gases. That's going to be the alveolar sac, and then the conducting zone are going to be, the mouth, the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and so forth and so on. So here is a little bit more about the conducting zones. They're fairly rigid. They have ever branching, smaller, right, nose, mouth, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles. And this is important. They are, in other words, the conducting area where you're going to be, mainly moving the air through, like the bronchi and the bronchioles. That is considered dead air space. And it's an important concept because normally we end up, don't memorize these numbers, but we average taking about a half a liter of air, 500 mils of air, and about 150 mils of that 500 mils gets trapped in the dead air space. It's called dead air space, not because the air is dead, but it has to do with the fact that you cannot exchange O2, CO2 while you're in the bronchi or the bronchioles. So one of the reasons why you want to oxygenate the body by taking in deep breaths is that you then increase that volume, so you increase the amount of air that actually reaches the alveolar sac for exchange. So about only 350 mils out of 500 reaches the alveolar sac. The rest, the 150, stay in the bronchi, and they are then considered that is dead air space. And when you take patho, or if you've already taken patho or gone into this, then there are a lot of respiratory diseases like your COPDs, your chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders that have a hard time moving the air in and out, so that then how much reaches the alveolar sac has to take in consideration how much gets trapped in the bronchi and bronchioles. Okay, so enough about dead air space. You do have respiratory muscles because the lungs are elastic, but they're not muscular. So you do have to use the muscles, which are going to be able to contract and relax. And then there's a bead of water that acts like super glue between the thoracic cavity muscles and the lung, so that the lung passively gets pulled when these muscles of respiration contract. And that is the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles of the rib. So towards the end of this presentation, we'll get into the specifics about inspiration and expiration and how the muscles of the respiratory tract can either act to make the lungs larger or smaller. Okay, so, pretty picture. So this is like a cross section, sort of. Um, and here you go, mouth and nose, and then your pharynx, the larynx, so the voice box is right here. The trachea have all these cartilaginous rings, which protect it from collapsing. So God forbid if somebody karate chopped you in the neck, your air passages would not collapse. Good thing. Then you're going to get down to the chest cavity, which is protected by the ribs and the sternum. And then you've got your major bronchi dividing into the right and left lung. And they are going to divide like a tree 32 times. Again, don't memorize 32 times, but 32 times gives you an idea, like a tree, how it branches and gets smaller. So what you want to have is a lot of branching so you get a lot of surface area, so you get more bang for your buck, so to speak, when you take in a breath of air. It's more efficient. You might not think delivering 350 and losing 150 is good, but there's nothing in the body that is 100% efficient. And having that amount, 2/3, reach the alveolar sacs because of all the branching and the utilization of the air that you take in is really quite good when you look at the other types of organ system processes that are present. Okay, so then you have a pleural cavity, you have membranes that will protect them and surround them, and they have a little fluid, so they act as shock absorbers and so forth and so on. So, but the main thing that we're going to be talking about is the alveolar sacs in the lung. Okay, see if I can get to the next slide. There you are. There we go. All right, major function of the respiratory system is, guess what? To deliver oxygen to the body and get rid of the waste product, carbon dioxide gas. So I'm just going to refresh your memory about this because it's not on the slide. The reason why we have a respiratory system and the reason why we have a heart is that we're very complicated and we have trillions upon godzillion cells that have to be at least a millimeter away from a capillary bed. And that has to do with the fact that every cell in your body wants to get their energy, like in the form of ATP, and their building blocks in order to make whatever they need through a process called cell respiration, also called aerobic respiration. But what every cell in the body wants to be able to do, because it's easy, is to take in the oxygen and glucose, break it down in aerobic respiration, and make a lot of energy, 38 ATP, and a lot of building blocks that they're going to be able to assemble into other things. And then the waste products of this process is carbon dioxide gas and water. So there's absolutely no substitution for cell respiration. Every cell has to do it. So that's the reason why you have to. Now, you can store glucose in the liver, and you can store glucose as glycogen in your skeletal muscle, but you cannot store oxygen. So that's the reason why, you take your first breath, and you continue to breathe until the day you die. So the reason why you have to keep on breathing is that you have to keep on extracting that oxygen from the air because you can't store it. Okay, enough about that. That is not going to be on the quiz, but I just want to mention it because this is what drives the entire system. All right, 4 distinct processes in respiration. Pulmonary ventilation, which I will get into in a couple of slides. That's breathing. External respiration. Now, it's considered external respiration because you're taking the air from the outside external to you, and you're breathing it in. And then you get it down to the alveolar sac, and then you can exchange O2, CO2 at the lung. So, but that's the reason why I call it external respiration. Transport is the transport of the gases once you get them in the blood. And then internal respiration is an exchange inside the body where you have your systemic capillaries at the systemic cells, or the body cells, and you're going to have the arterial blood that's highly oxygenated at that level, when you get down to the systemic capillaries, deliver the oxygen and the glucose. And then you have to get rid of the waste products of cell respiration, which is carbon dioxide gas and water, and then venous blood brings that back to the heart. So the fact that all of this is done within the body, that's the reason why they call it internal respiration. And some of this we'll discuss in this PowerPoint, and some of it we'll discuss in the next PowerPoint. Okay, so this is kind of an up-close and personal view of the alveolar sac. They're almost like grape-like sacs. They're one cell thick, so you can exchange gases. And so here are all the alveolar sacs. And then you have your smaller bronchioles, and then they feed to larger bronchioles, and eventually through the rest of the conducting system of the respiratory tract. All right, so this is something that's very unique to the respiratory tract, and this is something I would like you to know, and it has to do with the respiratory membrane. And it says the respiratory membrane is the fusion of the alveolar membrane with the pulmonary capillary membrane in order to enhance gas exchange. So I chose this picture because I kind of like the idea that you sort of see that the capillaries are very much in contact with the alveolar sac. Why is it important to have a respiratory membrane? It's important to have a respiratory membrane. It's important to fuse these two membranes because the amount of time that the red blood cell is given to get rid of the CO2 and to take up more oxygen is 0.3 seconds. Again, don't memorize 0.3 seconds, but it's not a lot of time. So you don't want to have, in which you do with the rest of the body, you tend to have a space between, let's say, the pulmonary capillary and the body cells. That it's called an interstitial space. It's not a big deal, but when you get to the lung and you have to oxygenate extremely quickly, then if you fuse the membranes, then there's no airspace. So it isn't as though the oxygen or the CO2 have to go from, let's say, the pulmonary capillary to a space, even if it's filled with water, it doesn't matter, and then into the alveolar sac. That's going to take time. It's not going to take a lot of time, but when you only have 0.3 seconds, it's worth to fuse those membranes because that way the transport is instantaneous. And that's the importance of the respiratory membrane. And you're only going to find them in the lung. Breathing. Here we go. I'm going to try to make this as intuitive as possible rather than throwing around 5 million terms and 5 million pressures. Ventilation or breathing has two parts to it. Inspiration, taking in a breath, airflow into the lung, and expiration. Gases exit the lung. Okay, so let me go to the next slide and try to talk this through first. Air moves high to low pressure. And you could also think about air moving from high to low concentration. So what it means is that the only way that you can take in air, inhale air, exhale air, is by having a pressure difference between the outside and the inside. The outside pressure isn't going to change. We are at sea level. Again, don't memorize these numbers, but you have a pressure at sea level of about 760 cubic millimeters of mercury. And the number changes depending on how you calculate it, whatever. But the atmospheric pressure is not going to change. So the lung pressure has to change. So you want to create a situation in inspiration where the pressure in the lung goes down. And that means then that the higher atmospheric pressure will rush, the air will rush into the lung because it always goes high to low pressure. Then when you want to exhale, you have to reverse that. You have to increase the pressure in the lung in order for the air to move out of the lung into the atmosphere. So it's up to the lung to do that. The problem is that the lung is not a muscle, so that's the reason for that small bead of water between the lung and the muscles of the respiratory tract. So what happens in inspiration, you have your respiratory control center in your medulla. It's going to fire nerves, which will innervate the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles of the rib. They're going to contract. And when they contract, they actually make the chest cavity larger and pull the lungs with it. So now the pressure is low, air rushes in, ta-da, inhalation or inspiration. Now, the nerves have to recover after they fire, and in that recovering, what both your chest cavity and your lungs, they are highly elastic. So I want you to think about an elastic. So you pull the elastic and you increase that space. So in inspiration, pressure goes down, air rushes in. When that nerve is recovering, there's going to be an elastic snap back. And then in that elastic recoil, you are going to have a point in time when the pressure in the lung in that elastic recoil snapback is going to be higher than atmospheric pressure. So that is how you exhale. That's how you do expiration. So you have a situation where every time you inhale, the medulla is firing the nerves to the muscles which contract, which actually rotate the rib cage out, so the pressure in the lung goes down, air rushes in. When the nerves recover, they snap back. That elastic snapback makes the lung highly pressurized, and so now the pressure is higher in the lung and air rushes out. And that cycle continues from the day the baby is slapped on the bottom until the day the person dies. And rather than inundate you with a lot of terms, I just would like you to get that basic concept down. Okay, so respiratory is always described relative to atmospheric. Air moves at high to low pressure. And so when you have the respiratory muscles contract, the lower the pressure, that's inspiration, elastic recoil, expiration, and is controlled by the respiratory center in the medulla, which can control the rate and depth of breathing. All right, so this is going to be the last concept for this particular PowerPoint presentation. And this has to do with airway resistance. Airway resistance is going to be very important when you get into your COPDs, because chronic bronchitis and asthma are airway resistant problems. So what happens normally? This is lovely, and let me make it into English. In fact, I'm going to make it into English by going to the next slide. All right. Airway resistance is how easy is it to have air flow in and out the bronchium bronchioles. And in healthy people, the airway resistance is quite low because you have lovely, normal, if not slightly dilated bronchium bronchioles, and air moves in and out fine. If there is some trigger, let's say that would trigger an asthmatic attack, what would then happen is that certain chemical mediators would cause bronchoconstriction. And because the smooth muscle of the bronchium bronchioles are circular, when you start to contract that, the air passage gets very, very small. So if you have pathological bronchoconstriction, breathing becomes incredibly difficult. And in an asthmatic attack, the airway resistance is quite high due to the bronchoconstriction. The reason why people carry an EpiPen with them that's filled with epinephrine, aka adrenaline, is that it can instantaneously dilate the bronchi and bronchioles and reduce the airway resistance and get the person being able to move that air in and out with ease. So that very much with a lot of different pathologies of the pulmonary system, airway resistance becomes an issue. And I do believe that's the end. So I will see you soon for part 2. Take care.